First of all, I'm glad I'm here. Thanks for having me. Second thing is, okay, so you hear I'm a professor at Fuller. And what's the first thing you think professors are going to do? They're going to stand behind a podium, they're going to give you a PowerPoint presentation, and they're going to bore you to sleep. Oh yeah, and then give you a test. So, I'm going to do no PowerPoint today. I am also not going to stand behind the podium. I'm going to wander about. The other thing I want to tell you is I like to be interrupted. You're used to professors or folks talking and you're like, I got to wait for the Q&A period. I am more interested in what you have to say than what I have to say. I'm good at this. I can figure out how to get my stuff in. It's far more interesting to me what you're thinking than what I'm thinking. So if at any point somebody's got a question, raise your hand. And if you don't, I will pause at various points and try to pull it out of you if that's okay. I was doing this, I do a lot of work with the Fuller Youth Institute. And I gave that little introduction one time. Instantly, a youth minister raised his hand. And I go, oh, what's your question? He goes, no, I was just testing you. So here's how I want to start out today. I'm tired, and so are you. And so is your congregation. Anything we do today has to acknowledge that. It would be very easy to come to this kind of a thing and think, oh great, they're going to pile a bunch of new stuff on me that none of us has the energy to do. I promise that's not what we're interested in today. I'm tired, and so are you. What I think about when I say that is I want to talk to you about why you're tired. Because if you can figure out why you're tired, it's actually going to help you know what to do and help you understand the people that are tired. But also, one of the things that happens when we're tired, and one of the things that happens when we encounter new things, is we feel stuck. I don't know what to do. When you feel stuck, you don't want someone to tell you, here is the correct answer. Just follow this formula and all will be well. Because we don't trust that person. They don't know my world. What do you want when you're stuck? You want positive options. You want stuff you can try. And if that doesn't work, I want more stuff I can try. And so long as I feel like I've got positive options, then I feel like I know what I can do. Think of today as we're going to just accumulate a whole bunch of positive options. Stuff you can try when the time is right, whenever you begin to feel stuck. But the first thing I want to say to you is I understand you're tired, and I understand your people are tired. And we're not going to pile stuff on you. So that's the first thing. Anybody want to say anything in response to that before I even go any further?
Amen.
Okay, at least I got an amen out of that. Yes, sir.
In most organizations that tell their people, whether it's a church or some other organization, to take risks, and then the first time they take a risk and fail, they get squashed.
Uh-huh.
So how do we get beyond that in the church?
Oh, I love that question. What you've just accidentally stumbled in is into one of the terrible mistakes. You have asked a professor to tell a story about the thing that he's writing about. So, can I pause and tell that story right now, even though it was supposed to come later? You don't mind if I do that now? See, because one of the things that I would argue is that we need to find ways to create experiments on the margins, places where we can try stuff where nobody notices we're trying stuff. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Think about it. If you were opening a restaurant, may I use yours as an example? What's your name? Michelle. Let's say Michelle is opening a restaurant. She wouldn't announce a grand opening on the very first day they try. They have what they call a soft opening. They try stuff, they get all the kinks out, and then all of a sudden there's a grand opening. But what do we do in the church? We announce what we're going to do before we even know what we're going to do. And then we decide that we announce that it's coming with music and a logo and theme music, and it's just a big deal. And then we say, come watch us make our rookie mistakes in public. Do you believe that when you try something new, you will make rookie mistakes? I mean, that's the nature of being rookies. So let's find ways to make our rookie mistakes where nobody's noticing that, get good at what we're going to do, and then we can bring it into prime time. Let me give you this example. When my daughters were learning to drive, I took them out to the church parking lot on a Sunday afternoon when nobody was there. And we set up some dirt, big old dirt clods, maybe 15, 20 feet apart, and they were supposed to just weave in and out to practice. And we made up a whole story and just like, okay, you're navigating over this world. Oh no, you just crushed the whole world. And we joked about it and it was fun. And what happened? The cost of being wrong was really low. Nobody was noticing, and we just joked about it. But let's say instead that I was the most supportive dad in the world. And so what I did is we built a grandstand. And we invited all my daughter's friends. And they came with banners. And they had fathead posters of their heads. And they had chants. And they had all this stuff as they were watching them learn to drive. Would that have helped? What would it have done? Added pressure. It would have made it terribly difficult to make any tiny little mistake. It would have been saying, let's make our rookie mistakes in public. Yet what do we do in the church? We want so hard for people to think we're trying something that we make an announcement and then we say, come watch us learn to drive in public. And then we make the rookie mistake and go, well, I guess that thing didn't work, and we'll go on to something else. Well, is anyone surprised at how comically bad my daughter was the first time she drove? No, that was just kind of normal. That's what it means to learn to drive. And we had to practice, and we had to practice. And sometimes they want to take it into prime time too soon. My older daughter, she had a friend that lived in the next little valley over that was, LA is connected by a bunch of freeways. And to get there, you had to drive on what might be considered graduate level freeway. And she wanted to go to drive to her friend's house when she had her permit. And I said, Elizabeth, I don't think you're going to want to do this. She goes, no, Dad, I can do it. Well, what are you going to? Okay, fine. So we're pulling from the 57 freeway onto the 10. She gets maybe 10 feet onto the on-ramp and goes, nope, and just pulls over. Because she looked and she realized that in order to merge, she had to merge into 3 lanes coming from 3 different directions, all at different speeds. And she thought, oh, I've got this whole surface streets thing down. How hard can it be? Okay, we as a church do exactly that. There's sometimes we'll try stuff and we'll get like 10 minutes into it and go, well, this is just going to crash and burn. And we just got to recognize it's not the end of the world. Okay, and you just keep moving forward. So part of what I want to do is make it so that we can find ways to try stuff on the margins that people don't even know we're trying new stuff. There's a restaurant in California called the California Pizza Kitchen. I think they have them in different places. Well, their test restaurant happens to be across the street from Fuller. So whenever, if we want to go out to eat or something, we go over there, and there's a portion of the menu that is new items. So it's a different menu than anywhere else in the country. And so we try stuff, and it's always kind of fun to see what things made it and what things kind of didn't. Because some of it you try, you go, well, that's a really interesting idea. I would have never thought of that. And other things you try and you go, I don't think this one has a future. And okay, I'm not always right. Sometimes I think this thing doesn't have a future, and it turns out to be something that makes it into mainstream. And there's this one thing that they had, and I kept saying, when are you going to? No, nobody liked that. Well, I did. So, uh-oh. We've got to be careful whether we take our opinion of what just happened and turn that into what's really going on. So that was not what I intended to say right now, but you ask a question, and if I'm going to say that leadership begins with listening, which we're going to talk about a little later, I better listen to you. So any other comments or questions before we get started? Well, then I started by saying that we're all tired. I would like to tell you why we're tired. Because if you can understand that, you can understand not just why you're tired, but why your people are tired and what to do about it. I was talking to one of my mentors who, he came to the church where I was growing up when I was 17 years old. He came to be my youth minister. I'm sure there were other kids in the youth group, but really he came to be my youth minister. And now, 40 years later, we're still good friends. And he's pastor at a large enough church that you would have heard of it. And so he and I talk about at least once a month. He came to stay at our house last weekend. We're close. And we were about maybe 2 months into the pandemic. And we were still trying to figure out how to make sense of all of this. And he says to me kind of casually, he goes, I don't think we have one crisis. I think we're all facing 4 crises. I thought, I don't know what that means. Do tell. He said, we all know there's a medical crisis, but there's also an economic crisis. Almost everybody you know has had their job affected by the pandemic and the like. But there's also a political crisis. Any of us can read the paper and understand what's going on in the world to say enough that there is a political divide in our world that's a crisis. And he said there's also a racial crisis. There have been all sorts of racial issues under the surface that we have had to face for years that are now erupting to the surface in a new way. And he says we're really facing 4 crises. I would add a 5th, actually. Any of you who have elementary age kids understand that we have an educational crisis, because the entire premise of elementary education is about we're going to take these people and put them in this space in this time and that's how it's all going to work. And you couldn't do it anymore. And that just creates all sorts of trouble for every teacher and every parent I know. So we have 5 crises. Well, how do you face that? Well, I'm going to offer a very California image for you for a moment. If you go to the beach, California, any place else, you see, waves rolling in, right? You ever been out in the water and you see a wave coming in and you kind of prepare for it and you kind of go up and it kind of goes up and then it goes down. That's really actually kind of soothing. I like that. And there's a little lull. Then another wave comes along, and so long as it's nice, predictable, that's really great. But what we're experiencing is a lot more like whitewater. You ever been whitewater rafting or seen whitewater rafting? And you come along and you have no idea what's around the next bend. And you have no idea where the next wave's coming from. And they're all coming at different speeds at different times, like my daughter trying to merge on the freeway and go, nope. And oftentimes the only time you even know the wave is coming when it smacks you in the head. We live in a world that is not predictable. If the world were nice and predictable, we could take a deep breath between waves and we could figure it out. But the reason it's so exhausting is because we're not facing one crisis. We're facing 5 crises, any one of which would have been front page news. Oh, there's a hand up. I love it. Thank you. What's your name?
Joel.
Thank you, Joel.
Can I add a 6?
Oh, please do.
I want to say a faith crisis, but I don't know that it's a faith crisis. It's definitely a religious crisis.
Amen. Amen. And the context of the conversation is we all know that this is a faith crisis and that this is what we're facing. Let's talk about what we are facing. But absolutely, positively, yes, we are facing a faith crisis. Yeah, there's certainly a climate crisis, but part of the struggle with that is that people get so caught up in all these other ones that it's easy for them to ignore them. We could list a bunch of these crises. Can we all agree that it's not like there's one predictable set of waves calmly rolling in and we can deal with it, but it's all smacking us in the head? That's what's so exhausting. The other thing that I would tell you is that the way that the church handles change is no longer working. Let's go back 500, 1,000 years ago. Large, giant change happened once a century or so. And what would happen is everybody could follow the wait and copy plan. What you would do is you wouldn't know how to handle that change. But what would happen is that somebody would figure it out. You could just hunker down, wait till somebody figured it out, and then copy them. And then everything would be normal for a generation or so. And then the Industrial Revolution happens. It starts happening more frequently. By the early 20th century, giant change was coming at least once a generation. Scholars will tell you by the 1960s, giant change was happening probably every 10 years. Now we are facing a situation where it's happening multiple changes at once within a 7-year period. Think about just since 2007, 14 years ago. In 2007, we had the invention of the smartphone. Is there anybody here whose lives have not been changed by the smartphone? Everybody you know. One of the things the Fuller Youth Institute will tell you that every human being is constantly facing questions of identity, belonging, and purpose. Can we agree that smartphone usage has changed identity, belonging, and purpose in our society? So that's just 2007. Oh wait, what happened in 2008? Giant economic crisis that really didn't get fully played out at least until 2011. And then we have the election cycle of 2016, which changed political discourse dramatically. Again, rise of social media. And then we end up with something like a pandemic. I'm sure you heard about it. Those are just the biggest things. We could have named other things. Normally in the old world, that would have been something that would have been every 10 to 20 to 40 years. And that's just happened in the last few years. Scholars will tell us that it takes at least 7 years for a society to figure out how to respond to a giant social change. In other words, if we have 7 years between waves, we can figure it out. But if we don't have 7 years between waves, before we've kind of gotten our breath from the last wave, the next wave is on top of us. And that's why it's so exhausting. So what do we do about that? So what do we do? I want to talk about not just what we do, but why what we're currently doing doesn't work. Many of you were trained in seminaries. I'm in favor of seminaries. I'm a seminary professor. I've devoted my life to seminary. And I would like to tell you that the old model of seminary no longer works. We've already said the church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. Seminary education is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. Let me tell you what the old model looks like, and then let me tell you what the new model needs to be. The old model is what we might call the Theological Camels model. It's what a scholar about 20 years ago called it. And what the model is you pump people with enough knowledge and you send them out in the desert and hope it lasts a lifetime. And a camel's not actually that's a good model if you're trying to get from one place to another. If you are in a desert and you're trying to get from this oasis to that oasis, a camel's got you covered. So if you are going to a very predictable situation, a camel model of education will work for you. But what if over the next sand dune, instead of more desert, there's a barrio, or a shopping mall, or a seashore, or a global pandemic? Camel's going to be really difficult. So what we need is some kind of a model of educating that will teach you agility. You need to be, able to respond to what's over the next sand dune, even if you don't know what it is. And you need to be able to equip your people to be able to respond to what is over the next sand dune, even if they don't know what it is. For example, I got a very good education. I was a graduate of Fuller Seminary, but at not one point in my education did anyone talk to me about the internet. Do you know why? Because the internet as we know it wasn't invented until after I graduated. I can't tell you what's coming, but I can tell you it will surprise you. And I can tell you it will surprise your people. And the last thing that we want to do is follow a model that, remember I told you about the model that doesn't work, which is the wait and copy model? The other big model that we tend to do is the change and freeze model. That finally we figure out how to respond to something, and we do it well, and it lasts for a little while, and we say, fine, let's never change again. Yeah, we've been doing that for 5 years. That must be always. And it worked once a time. You know, I was talking just yesterday, day before yesterday, to some of my students. And one of them was talking about, he's a youth minister. And he was saying he'd gotten together a bunch of the parents to talk about, he'd gotten together a staff of his church to talk about what youth ministry was supposed to be, because they wanted him to kind of reboot youth ministry. And the way they wanted to reboot youth ministry for the future was to recreate what had been done in the 90s. Because it worked for us, and we ended up as ministers, literally that's what they said, it worked for us, it can't be all bad. And his response is, do you think teenagers today are the same as you were in the 90s? And the people responded, well, of course not. And then the implicit answer was, but they should be. And so so his boss was saying to him essentially, no, I recognize that replicating the past won't work, but that's because there's something wrong with the world. There's nothing wrong with the way we're doing ministry. And I want to suggest to you that the world is going to change. And now we're going to figure out how to be agile and how to not just figure out what are we going to do today, and we're going to try something. And by the end of the day, we'll have things that we can try, and boy, won't that be great? And then once we try, then we will never have to change again. Won't it be great that we can solve this problem and it will just go away? The problem is not the pandemic. The problem is that the world is going to continue to change in ways that none of us can predict. And you're going to have to figure out not how to respond to the pandemic, but you're going to have to learn how to respond to things that are going to surprise you. And here's the solution that I'm going to propose a solution that we're all going to vote out of existence. And the solution is, can't we just go back to the old world? Let me give you an example that's very close to you. Anybody here know anything about football? You've heard of football around here? There's a team that plays in Atlanta called the Atlanta Falcons. They don't play very well right now, but there's a team there. And they built, not that long ago, something called the Georgia Dome. Y'all remember the Georgia Dome? They just tore it down. They just built the Georgia. Why did they tear it down? Because the world changed. And why did the world change? The world changed because of the smartphone he's got in his hand right there. What happened is what it meant to go to a football game was no longer what it was even within the living memory of most of these folks. It used to be that you'd go to a football game for the experience of the football game, and going to the football game and what happened on the field turned out to be normally pretty important to a game, right? What had happened is they realized that People could have a better experience of actually the game itself by staying home and watching it on high definition television. So what do? How is it that the Falcons could figure out we want people to keep coming to the game? They built a new stadium with what? Talk to me about it. The halo. They call it the halo. They've got all this kind of television stuff. So what happens? If you watch people, they still tailgate. They still come and they cheer. And then a play happens, and are they looking at the... they're looking up at the screen. Now, what was interesting is when that was first proposed, there were a lot of owners of football teams and other football purists who were very angry. And they said, no, you should not be catering to people's whims and allowing them to watch football on TV in the stadium when it's right there in front of them. And they interviewed a bunch of advertisers. And the advertisers were kind of upset because they wanted an old way of football. And the consensus among the advertisers was, can't we just convince people to go back to the way things once were? And so what they had is a period of time where they had some advertising that was catered towards people that we want to make the world go back to the way that it once was, and then another group of people that were catering towards the world as it is. Which one worked? Yeah, you can't just turn to people and say, you know, you've got this high definition television that you could be watching. Why don't we pretend that doesn't exist for a while? Would that be okay for you? No. But the phrase they kept using is, can't we just go back to the way things once were? Can't we use our authority to convince people to do things the way that was better for us? Can't we just use our authority to do things that's better for us? I think, let me finish this part, and then I think we in the church do just that. You tell me stories about what's going on, you say, okay, how can we use our authority to get people to stop being the way they are and go back to being the way that was more convenient for us? Because we have a church that is calibrated for this world that no longer exists. Let's use our authority to get that world to come back. You think that's going to work for people? No. Yes, sir.
My comment goes along with what you said. Unfortunately, I'm the slow one in this story. And that is that one Sunday morning I'm processing, and I walk by a young man sitting on the aisle, and he's watching the service on his the service that he's in.
Yeah.
He's on the iPad, and I lean over to him and I said, I'm never looking in person. But he still continues to watch the service on his iPad.
Well, and
He was one of those people who were early with the computer and technology stuff.
yeah, and I'm thrilled he's still there.
Many of them are not.
Yeah.
They're watching from home.
Well, I remember when I was working with a church where they were really angry because they saw all these young people on their phones during church, especially during the reading of Scripture. And I had to explain to the pastor, many of them now keep their Bible as an app. And he said, why would they do that when they can carry God's Word with them? And there was something in his mind that said, a bound copy is more God's Word than something printed on your phone. He's since come around. Yes, sir.
So Scott, many of our churches are heavily weighted towards older members.
I've heard that story before.
What you are saying absolutely frightens them to death.
We're going to spend an enormous amount of time talking about that today. Because here's my response to that. I feel empathy for them. I cannot scold them for their fears. I cannot sit here and sit in judgment of their fears. I have to understand their fears. And I cannot be dominated by them. How do we live in that tension? My sister-in-law is a cardiologist. She's a nurse practitioner, and oftentimes patients will come to her, and she will have to tell them things like, you need to have a stent put into your heart, you need to lose weight, you need to quit smoking. And they feel the fear that you were just describing. She is deeply empathetic with them. But does she tell them, say, well, because you're so afraid, let's go ahead and let you keep smoking? She can't do that. She has to find a way to be both deeply empathetic and help them step into a world that is terrifying to them. That's your job.
Because that's what's more convenient. This keep on smoking, keep on doing that. It's harder, and it's harder on the leader. You're going to have to work harder than just letting it slide and doing it when that's convenient.
You could be more short-term popular if you just let people do what they want. There are a lot of people in our world, I will not name names, that could get in trouble, who have made their reputation, their world, by telling people what they want to hear and telling them it's not that bad. You don't have to change. And there's people that are dead today because they were told that. We don't want to be those people. We want to be like my sister-in-law, the cardiologist, and say, how do we do both things? How do we help people face their fears because they're legitimate fears? And how do we help them step into a world that is terrifying to them? That's our job. This is what you signed up for. Now, I'm a professor of leadership. So at some point you're going to ask me about leading. So can I just tell you what I think leadership is? Is that okay? And to do that, I want to talk about the Bible. You don't mind if every so often today I talk about the Bible? That's going to be okay with you? Okay. And if you don't, you let me know. We'll make it, we'll face your fears together. Yeah, I've got to use a bound copy. Well, in this case, I memorized it. That's okay, right? Okay, that's still okay. I want to point you to 1 Corinthians 3:6. You don't have to look it up. I'm going to quote it for you. You know how 1 Corinthians is constructed. The Corinthians, 1st and 2nd, there's probably other letters that we don't have, are letters back and forth between Paul and the Corinthians. And the Corinthians church was deeply fractured. There were all these factions in the churches and all these questions. And in 1 Corinthians 3:6, Paul's talking about that factions. And he says, Paul planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And so one verse tells a little story. There's three actors in this story. There's God, there's Paul, and there's Apollos. Which one is most important in that story? Please say God. Okay, because if you hadn't said God, we would be having a different conversation. Paul planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Part of the moral of that story is that neither Paul nor Apollos can create growth. My grandfather was what the Bible would call a steward. He had 140 acres of citrus, but there was an absentee landlord. So he ran the farm, but he did not own the farm. And what did my grandfather spend his days doing? My grandfather spent his days dealing with the soil, tilling weeds, paying attention to trimming and all this kind of stuff. He created an environment for growth. Could he make his trees grow? There was no guaranteed outcome. If what you're looking for is a guaranteed outcome, you've come to the wrong place. I had a student who was the president of a ball bearing company. They had a factory, and you could put material in this side, and all these things happened, and you got ball bearings at this end every single time. And if you didn't, you stopped and fixed the machine. And it worked every single time. And he wanted a way to have church be like a ball bearing company, to where whatever we did at this end, whatever we did here, we had a guaranteed outcome at this end. How's that going to work out for him? We can't do that. But it's actually worse than you think. My grandfather, one of the valley where he was a farmer in Southern California, the annual lowest it ever got was 28 degrees. So just below freezing. And they had to worry about sometimes the trees freezing. And this was back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And what they did there is they had something called smudge pots. Anybody here ever heard of smudge pots? Smudge pots are pipes about this big filled with motor oil. I grew up in a town where my house was surrounded on three sides by orchards. When you say the word, the phrase smudge pots, a smell comes to my head. I know exactly what smudge pots are. And what they are is, imagine if you light motor oil on fire. What's it going to look like? What? Big, black, hazy smoke. And it would be heavy and it would descend on the orchard. And my grandfather's job was to spend all night long wandering through his orchard, making sure the smudge pots were still lit. Now, when I was a kid, I thought the whole purpose of smudge pots was to elevate the temperature. Light things on fire, and that's not actually how they worked. What happened is that, that whole cloud of dark black smoke, it was really oily and oozy, and it would cover all the leaves. And that would make it so they wouldn't freeze. So it was this oily, oozy haze that was the whole point. So here's my question for you. What did my grandfather look like in the morning? That oily, oozy haze covered every little bit of him. I would like to suggest to you that some days that's your job. You're going to be doing stuff, and you're going to do just the right thing. And it means you're going to be up all night. And you're going to be up all night doing stuff that is painful and oily and oozy. And the reward you get in the morning is you're going to be covered with this oily, oozy mess. And I got to tell you right now, that's what you signed up for. That's not something where you can say to yourself, I can't believe this happened to me. This is what you've signed up for. And so there's going to be moments when you have to help people through their pain. And they're not going to love it. You know the stages of grief? Anybody know what the denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. People don't resist change, they resist loss. That's a quote from a guy named Ronald Heifetz. People don't resist change, they resist loss. People don't resist change, they resist loss. And every time there is a loss, there is a grief process. We may actually spend some more time on that later this afternoon. We are likely to do that. But my question for you is this. If you help people through their denial, what is the reward that is waiting for you? What comes after denial? Anger and blame. So if you help your people through their denial and do exactly the job you're supposed to do, what is the reward that is waiting for you? At some point, some of them are going to be mad at you. And you're going to want to say, don't you know what I'm trying to do here? I had a student who was a chaplain. And she got called she got called down to the emergency room because there was a woman who was by herself in the emergency room who had come in, and she had had a miscarriage. And they wanted the chaplain to care for her. So my student, the chaplain, comes walking in, and she says, I'm the chaplain, and the woman says, I don't want to talk to you, I don't want to talk to anybody, I just want to get out of here. And so my chaplain student says, I understand that completely. I just don't want you to be alone right now. So I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to quietly pray. You don't have to say anything, you don't have to do anything, but I just don't want you to be alone. And so she sits down, and the woman turns to her and just starts yelling at her. She's angry at the doctors. She's angry at God. She's angry at my student. She's just yelling at her because of the pain that she's in. Did my student take it personally? Of course not. Here's what my student said. I knew it was the grief talking. You're going to need that phrase. I knew it was the grief talking. Over and over again in your world, people are going to be angry at you about stuff you didn't do. Or worse yet, stuff you did that was actually helping them. I mean, my student came there to be kind to her. And what was the reward she got? Did that teach my student will never go into a patient's room again? Of course not. What did my student say? That's exactly what I signed up for. I am there representing Jesus, and God can handle it. I am there for you. A significant part of what your job is when there is pain is just to be like that chaplain. So let me check my notes and see what things I have forgotten.
Can I comment?
Oh, please do.
Okay. We connect the dots, right? Can we connect dots?
I sure hope so, because that's, yeah.
So, change is coming at us from all directions at all times, not stopping.
Uh-huh.
With change comes loss, with loss comes grief.
Yep.
With grief comes the stages,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep, you're getting there.
Godliness notwithstanding, being able to not have to go through the stages of grief, right? Some of our people are angry all the time.
Okay, what do we do? What do we do when some of our people are angry all the time? They have good reason to be right now. Let's just say, what's your name? Jackie. Let's just say Jackie here, if I just regularly poked her with a stick, just, every couple of minutes, just for the sake of it, I poked her with a stick. Would she be angry? And will we say, well, you were angry an hour ago, why are you still angry? Well, because you keep poking me with a stick. Society is poking our people with a stick because of all the different changes. All the different things that we have to face. All the crises together. It's like poking people with a stick. And it's just really hard. Almost everybody you know is angry right now. You're angry right now. I think of it this way as, I think that patience requires a certain amount of energy. Patience requires like some muscle. The problem is we've been using that muscle constantly for 18 months or longer, and the muscle just doesn't work much anymore. And so the very littlest thing will set us off. I just don't have the patience for that right now. I don't know what that thing is, but every one of us experience it. What do you do in that moment? We're going to spend the rest of today honestly talking about what do you do in that moment. Because that's what your people are experiencing. You don't get to blame them. I don't get to blame Jackie if every so often I poke her with a stick and she gets angry. It's not Jackie's fault that she's angry that I'm poking her with a stick. The world is poking our people with a stick, and they're angry at the world. There's a good reason for that. So I'm going to pause for a second. Any other questions before I go on? Because I want to offer some hope in a moment. Because part of what I'm starting with is I want to tell you how bad your problem is. Because I want you to understand it well enough to know that whatever I'm going to propose takes seriously the depth of your problem. What if somebody come to my sister, the sister-in-law, the cardiologist, and she knew all these things were wrong, and she goes, you know, I don't think they can handle that. I'll just tell them, you don't have much wrong with you. They'd feel good about her, and then they'd die. What she really has to do is, let me tell you how bad it is, and then we're going to work on it together. That's what you want from people who really care about you. That's what we're going to do today. Fair enough? Oh, yes, sir.
I think one of the reasons why it's very difficult is because too many of us believe that we have to be the good guy in every situation. Sometimes, and I haven't had this conversation with a friend of mine, that a person who is liberation-minded isn't trying to tear down the system because they hate the system. It's because they love the people that are being victimized by
Amen.
the system. And sometimes we don't want to be the bad guy. We want to always come out and be the good guy. But I don't think we've really taken a close look at Jesus.
Yeah.
Because Jesus,
How'd that work out for him?
yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, is that we have these I think overall, these grandiose ideas of what we're going to do. And when we run into a situation and it doesn't happen the way we envision it, now we got to try to make nice with people in order to try to smooth things over. But I think there's a lot of internal identity issues that we got to deal with, because, yeah, you're right. A lot of us have been groomed for a church that doesn't exist anymore. And now we've had 18 to 20 months to relaunch everything. And we got people that are saying, when we come back, I want to go back to what we had.
Can't we go back to the world that once was?
No.
And what's your name?
Tyree.
Tyree?
Tyree.
Tyree. I've got a job for you, Tyree. I want you to be sure to ask that question more than once today. Because what I think is going to happen is we're going to talk, and then by late afternoon, we're going to get to the point where we're going to say to ourselves, can't we just be kind about this? And I want to give you a method that allows you to both be, see, you're feeling competing commitments. You would actually like to be kind to people because being kind to people is the kind of thing that's very Christian. It's not like you're trying to do it just to be liked. But at the same time, you want to be honest with people and help them. How do you live in that tension? I'm going to deputize you. Your job is to keep asking that question, because every single one of us when we go home is thinking that question. You accept that?
What's the pay?
I can offer you a really good right-handed Twix bar.
I'm hired.
There we go. So, oh yes.
I retired from the school system as a job coach. And every year we had, at the end of the year, we had an IEP meeting. And in those IEP meetings, I had to bring up the evaluation I had with the students. And we call that constructive criticism. Now, we actually told them what all they did really, really well, their strengths. But then we looked at their weaknesses also, and we would ask them their weaknesses. The constructive criticism was sometimes hard to accept, especially for the parents. But it helped us have such great communication.
So I'm going to go off on a little tangent here that I had not expected to go on. I'm going to sound like a professor for just like this long. It'll happen every so often today. I want to suggest to you, every single one of you who has people entrusted to your care, either volunteers or employees, somebody that you supervise, you bear 3 responsibilities: recruitment, training, and supervision. You bear 3 responsibilities: recruitment, training, and supervision. Recruitment, training, and supervision. The problem is we in the church have hit the trifecta. We do all 3 of those poorly. Instead of recruitment, we often just fill a slot. Instead of training, we provide a little bit of orientation and hope they just figure it out. Instead of supervision, we pat people on the head and tell them they're doing okay. Yeah, good job, good job. You know, you crashed and burned, but good job, it'll be okay. I want to suggest to you, we could revisit this and we can talk a little bit more about how to deal with each of those. But part of what I want to say is it Clara?
Clara.
Clara. What Clara was saying is about supervision. And I want to suggest to you 2 alternative models of supervision. Well, there's one model which is you don't do it. Can we agree that that one's probably the one the church does and we would like to replace it with a better model? And this is a conversation I have with my students, because the joke that I have is that they don't pay me to teach. I love to teach. They pay me to grade, because grading papers is hard. And you buy that. So I have a conversation with my students that actually comes from an article that Craig Dykstra wrote for Lilly Endowment. This is all funded by Lilly. This is a thing that comes from Lilly. Lilly distinguishes between 2 kinds of evaluation, or 2 kinds of supervision. There is what they would call summative assessment and formative assessment. Summative assessment, the purpose is to give a grade. So you take your driver's test, and the guy or woman that's sitting next to you says, yes, you are presently good enough at driving that we can, sorry about that, we can trust you with a driver's license. Or you go and you take your boards if you are a medical doctor, and you really want only doctors that pass the boards, right? You really don't want the ones that really didn't quite make the grade. So summative assessment is sometimes important. But formative assessment, the purpose isn't to say give a grade, it's to help people get better. So when we sent my 6-year-old daughter to ballet lessons, we didn't want the ballet instructor to go, yeah, she's a C+. I mean, we knew she was pretty crummy at it already. That's why we sent her. What we wanted was, and we got, was the ballet instructor that would get down next to her and try to teach her what to do. No, bend your knees like this, or that kind of thing. Or think about when I was, I don't know how old, and I took swimming lessons. Summative assessment is, yep, he's drowning. That really doesn't help us very much. I wanted the person next to me saying, no. And the phrase that they would use with my kids is big arms, big arms. They wanted them to come all the way around. And we wanted formative assessment to help them get better. Every single time you encounter your people, they need formative assessment. Not, you're doing about a B+, or you're doing an A. But here's what you're doing, why you're doing, and why it's going well, and here's what we can do that can help us get better. So I want to loop back all the way to the start of this conversation of you're tired, and your people are tired. Okay, now, can you offer me some hope? So I want to suggest to you a couple of Christian practices that are appropriate to people and congregations that are tired. So I preach at my church. I'm not the pastor. We have a group of people at our church that I call the feral pastors. These are people who are ordained but have other jobs, many of them as professors and the like. And I say, we were once domesticated, but then we ran away, and now this church is feeding us and they can't get rid of us. And this group of feral pastors, we get to preach every now and then. And so this is the congregation, this is the sermon that I've been preaching during COVID. And You would think you're only allowed to preach the sermon once. I've been preaching a version of it every time I preach. And so far, no one's called me on it. It starts out with, I'm tired and so are you. And then it talks about what are practices we can pursue. So I want to start, the first Christian practice I want to suggest to you is the practice of lament. There are psalms of lament. About 40 to 50% of the psalms are psalms of lament. How do you know which 40 or 50%? It's the ones they don't read in your church. And I want to suggest to you that the message of the psalms of lament is that God can handle your honesty. The message of the psalms of lament is that God can handle your honesty. The message of the Psalms of Lament is that God can handle your honesty even and especially if you are angry at God. Now we're used to, we think of God as, he's just like humans, only a little better. And we all know that if you've got a boss who's got a lot of power, the last thing you want to do is tick them off. And so the last thing you want to do is be honest with your boss, especially when you're angry. I want to suggest to you that part of the reason the Psalms of Lament exist is to give the people of God the language to be able to say the kinds of things to God that we would never think we are allowed to say in our churches. You can't say that to God. I'm just quoting scripture here. You can't say that to God. Do you know who that is? It would be disrespectful. Well, the Bible invites it. Let me give you an example. My very favorite psalm is actually a psalm of lament. It might be some of your favorite psalm, but you probably didn't know it was a psalm of lament. It's Psalm 139. Psalm 139, how does it start out? You've searched me and know me. You know my going in and my coming out. If I could take the wings of the dawn and fly, still you are there. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. It's 18 verses of how well God knows us. It's glory. And then there's 2 verses we skip. And then it says at the end, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. I want to suggest to you the 2 verses we skip are the entire purpose of the psalm. What does it say? Oh, that you would slay the wicked, and I have names for you. The point of the psalm is, I want you to kill people for me. So here's the structure of the psalm. This is legitimately the structure of the psalm. 18 verses that say, God, you know me better than I know myself. I might as well just be honest with you. I want you to kill people for me. If that ain't right, fix me. That's the psalm. I love that structure. I teach my congregation that structure. God, you know me better than I know myself. I might as well just be honest with you. Here's what I really want. If that ain't right, fix me. It's deeply biblical. But can you imagine how it would change our churches if they were allowed to talk to God that way? God, you know me better than I know myself. I might as well just be honest with you. Here's what I want. Here's what I'm feeling. If that ain't right, fix me. And it's such a statement of trust. Why do you think teenagers argue with their parents? Part of it's about individuation and all that, but part of it's because parents are safe. They're not going anywhere. God's not going anywhere. And we need to convey to our people. Remember, one of the first things we said is everybody's angry. What do you do with that anger? One key idea is you bring that anger to God. God can handle your honesty even and especially if you're angry at God. I'll give you a couple of examples of what to do with that in a moment. Now, if I was in charge of how every church ran their worship service, and it's very clear to me I'm not, But if I were in charge of worship services, I would make sure that every worship service had two elements in it. One where we lament, because we are supposed to weep with those who weep. And one where we rejoice and praise God, because we are supposed to rejoice with those who rejoice. And I would literally say to my congregation, just point blank, we're going to have parts every week where we talk about why things are hard, because you may not experience things as hard this week, but somebody is, and we're in it together. And every single week we're going to have times we celebrate together, because you may not feel like celebrating this week, but somebody does, and we're in this together. And you're probably, just like most of us, having parts of your week when you're just really angry and disappointed, and parts of your week when you recognize that things are going pretty well. And we want to recognize that together. Think about how freeing that would be for your people if they thought church was the kind of place they could be honest. Because we all have this idea of Sunday best. What do you wear to church on a Sunday morning? You dress your best. It's respectful to God. Used to be. Well, let's put it this way. At my church, after the sermon, there's a place you stand there and shake people's hand, and then you go out and they serve coffee, and we all kind of mill around and talk to each other. You know what that's like? And somebody walks up to you and says, "How you doing?" At my church, there are only two acceptable answers. Either you say, "I'm fine," or "I'm busy." I mean, nobody made this rule. There's no police that are enforcing this. But if you were just to kind of overhear all the conversations, those are the only two acceptable things that people say. People, I started to say people. My wife decided to try the other day to say what she was really feeling. We don't have a liturgy for it. We don't know how to respond to that. It's like you were speaking calculus to me. What do I? Yeah. What? How about them Dodgers? We don't. So one of the things you're going to ask me today is, what do we do? I want to suggest to you a significant part of your job is to plant language. You give people vocabulary so they know how to speak to God and how to speak to each other and how to respond to each other. We're going to plant vocabulary. And I'm going to give you examples throughout the day of how to plant that kind of vocabulary so that your people will know how to express themselves. Because one of the deep frustrations of social change is the old way of doing things doesn't work. And when the old way of doing things doesn't work, what do? We do it anyway, because we don't know anything else. Let me give you an example. When I was in seminary, we were in a Bible study group. 5 couples. 4 of the couples were, at least one of the persons in there was going to be a pastor. And in the 5th couple, the guy was going through the psych school, so he was going to get a psych degree. And one of the couples was the first one to have kids. And when they were pregnant, this would happen to be the guy who was going to become the psychologist. And I remember him saying one time, he said, when my kids grow up, I'm never going to yell at my kids. And we kind of joked. He says, "Oh, really?" And he goes, No, I've read the research. I understand that it doesn't do any good. And we all kind of chuckled at that. Well, about 10 years later, we'd all gone off, done our things. We happened to be in Southern California, a group of us, and so we all got together, kind of a reunion. And one of them turned to Dave and said, "So how'd that whole not yelling at your kids thing work out?" And he goes, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You said you were never going to yell at your kids because it didn't work." He goes, "I never said that." Everybody in the room goes, "Oh, we all remember it." Did he yell at his kids? Why? Because he didn't know what else to do. Let's say you're starving. You're really, really hungry. And the only thing in your cupboard is a can of soup that's expired. Will you eat the soup? And you just hope it works out. But I just told you it's expired. If that's the only thing in your cupboard, that's what you're going to do. Your people right now only have a few things in their cupboard. They don't know what to do, and the things in their cupboard are calibrated for a world that no longer exists. Your job is going to be to give them more vocabulary, more ways of talking to each other, more ways of talking to God, more ways of being church that will allow them to be able to live into a new world. You don't have to announce to them, I have a new plan. We are now going to do things differently. You just have to start using the vocabulary, and they'll pick it up. Can I give you an example of that? Years ago, 20-something years ago, my wife and I discovered that there were certain arguments that we had that were just like over and over again, the same argument. We realized there was one argument we actually called argument 1B, where just, it was kind of scripted. Now, it had different elements of it, but basically the argument was, if I'm working as hard as I can and not everything's getting done, it must be your fault. If I'm working as hard as I can and not everything's getting done, you must be slacking. And each of us would say it, and we realized, no, the solution to that problem is actually that there's more to be done than we can do. And we actually have had that argument enough times, we can skip to the end. Because we know the end of it is, there's too much to be done. And so we'll get in the middle of that argument, we won't know in there, and somebody will go, oh, this is argument 1B. And it just, we can just move forward with that now. My mic doesn't like me very much. Well, one of the things we also discovered is that there are times we'd be having arguments, and we would discover what happens when halfway through the argument, I discover I'm the one that was wrong. What do? There's not a whole liturgy for that in our society. So what we came up with is the only appropriate response to that is just to turn to the other one and say, you were right, I was wrong. Just like that. You were right, I was wrong. And the implication of it is, I thought we were arguing, and I realized that, no, I'm the wrong one. And it just takes all the steam out of it for us, because we've agreed together to do that. And so over time, that's just part of the way that my wife and I would talk to each other. We'd be in the middle of something, and then one of us would say that to the other, and we would be done. We didn't know we were accidentally planting language. We thought it was just us. But you know what happens when you have kids? They listen to you. Well, at one point, my daughter was like 15, 16 years old, and she has a couple of her friends over, and she and I are arguing about something. I know it's hard to picture that a dad arguing with a 15-year-old, but come with, indulge me on this one. And about halfway through the argument, she realized she was wrong. And she goes, oh, you were right, I was wrong, and started to walk away like we were done. And her friends go, what was that? Don't you know the rules? You're never supposed to give in. Yeah, you can't let your parents think they're right. What's the deal? And she goes, well, he was right. I thought that it was this, but now I realize no, and fine. And there was just no drama. And it freaked them out. Did I ever set and said, I'm going to be a good dad. I'm going to plant this language in my child. No, it just so happened they picked it up. Now, I could also tell you stories of language they picked up from me that I probably wish they hadn't picked up. I want to suggest to you, though, if you are very careful about how you plant language, you don't have to announce to your church, we're doing things differently now. You can just start using a language, and as you begin to use it in different settings, different people will pick it up, and it will spread.